it. Wendy did this to my arm. Three people. We got pictures by the photographer.
Way more than a rock band. As rock writer John Levy said in a recent interview on VH1, Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics were a phenomenon. They changed American fashion and music, and when they came to town, they were news. Anti-disco, anti-complacent assembly line rock, anti-bullshit, anti-banality, and anti-formula art. They were without a doubt, in many people's minds, the most radical band in the history of rock. Despised by the hacks of the rock establishment whom they assaulted with every turn, Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics were so far ahead of their time in so many ways, the world is still catching up, and some think it never really will. Wendy Orlean Williams, UK music writers Dante Benuto and Dave Dixon have written, was a force of nature. She shattered cultural and musical barriers and took command of territory previously reserved only for men, setting trends in music and culture at large that have yet to run their course today. She and the Plasmatics introduced the Mohawk to music and mass American culture, fused punk and metal when these two camps despised each other, and produced stage shows that Billboard magazine's Roman Kozak called the absolute limit of what can be accomplished in rock and roll theatrics, which included the chainsawing of guitars, the sledgehammering of TV sets, the collapsing of lighting trusses, and blowing up of speaker cabinets and full-size cars.
It was the Ramones times 10, you know? It was the Clash times 10. It was the Sex Pistols times 10, you know?
The Plasmatics was a concept put together around Wendy O. Williams by radical anti-artist Rod Swenson in 1977. Swenson, who got an MFA in art from Yale where he specialized in conceptual, performance, and neo-Dadaist art, held the view that the measure of art was how confrontational it is.
Dadaism came about in the early 20s as a result of particularly French and Germans' experience in the First World War, in the trench warfare. You know, these rat-infested, filthy ditches where men died by the thousands every day for no reason. And as a result of that, the Dadaists became confrontational.
After getting his MFA in 1969, he began a series of countercultural projects, which by the mid-70s found him in the heart of a pre-Disney-fied Times Square, producing experimental theater under the name of Captain Kink. It was here that he and Wendy O. Williams, her actual birth-given name, the O standing for Orlean, and her initials spelling WOW, met.
Wendy remained unique, and part of her character was this force of charisma. And I use the term force of charisma as opposed to charisma, because I think a lot of people have charisma which oozes out. Wendy's jumped out. It was explosive, it was dynamic, concussive and coruscating. And that put her into a league on her own.
She was very powerful, and she was also unprecedented. You couldn't pigeonhole Wendy. You couldn't say, oh, she's just like this or she's just like that. And she was so unique. She was such a unheard of individual that you couldn't say, oh, this is just this again. You know, like you could say with the Sex Pistols, oh, this is just, you know, Bowie and the glam rock guys again, just a little dirtier. You couldn't say that with Wendy because there had never been anything like her, ever. You know, maybe Calamity Jane or somebody like that. I mean, you can't pigeonhole Wendy because there was no precedent for her.
Completely rejecting the disassociated hypocrisy of the conformist culture around her, Williams had walked out on a repressive home in high school life in a small town in upstate New York when still a teen. And for the next several years, she hitchhiked her way across the U.S. and Europe, variously working as a macrobiotic cook in London, as a lifeguard in Florida, living in a tent in Boulder, and performing throughout Europe with a gypsy dance troupe.
Don't tell me what to do. Ain't none of your business.
By the time she arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal in New York City in 1976, Wendy was more convinced than ever that the only authentic way to live was in complete opposition to the banality, lethargy, complacency, and hypocrisy of the status quo. In the Port Authority, she happened upon a copy of Show Business Weekly someone had discarded on the bus station floor, where it lay open to a page with an ad for Rod's Theater. She applied for a job, and the rest, as they say, is history.
You know, Rod being on the cutting edge, and Wendy's energy was unbelievable, just all fueled by, you know, I felt like Rod was like the fuse.
What began was a relationship that saw Wendy's career launch less than 2 years later as culture-shattering icon and frontperson for what Boston's WBCN's Oedipus would call the most outrageous rock and roll band in the world. Wendy and Rod began auditioning potential band members in 1977, and in July of 1978, the Plasmatics gave their first public performance at later to become punk rock shrine CBGB in New York City.
If going all the way ain't right, honey, let's eat out tonight.
It ain't so true.
The earliest version of the band, which changed nearly half of its personnel with every record and had some 17 different drummers, bassists, and guitarists backing Wendy during the 10 years she performed, was a three-piece put together with a strong emphasis on visuals. It was quickly realized that the band needed a second guitarist to hold the group together musically, and guitarist Wes Beach was added to become, after Wendy, the only permanent member of the group playing or touring behind or otherwise involved in every Wendy O. Williams album ever recorded.
I'd seen Wendy and she was just totally riveting. I answered an ad in the Village Voice. I was looking for the world's fastest rhythm guitar player, and I showed up for the audition, and it was like something out of a Fellini movie. Jose, the Oriental bass player, answered the door, and he led me downstairs into a dank, dark basement with low, sweating pipes overhead. From there, the rest is history.
From its inception, designed to assault the status quo at every level, this was a band that actually stood for something, and what they stood for had nothing whatsoever to do with compromise, surrender, or sanitized, radio-friendly platinum crap. The favorite targets were hypocrisy, sexism, assumptions about the nature of music itself, and most particularly American materialism and consumerism, whose icons, TVs, and automobiles, often a Cadillac, Wendy would demolish on stage.
One, two, fuck you!
They were a force to be reckoned with really right from the moment they came out. I think they were conceived pretty much to be such. They were conceived as a battering ram from day one.
I see there being two different forms of art. I see there being passive art, which just goes along with the status quo. It just goes along with the formula. And I see there being aggressive art. Well, that's what we choose. We choose aggressive art.
Particularly galling to Wendy was the way men were allowed to be strong, aggressive, and powerful in rock or contemporary culture, while women in music were expected to be soft, pretty, sweet, or sentimental, and submissive. As Maria Raha wrote in her book Cinderella's Big Score, Wendy was sexual without being submissive, not only in her attitude and culture-revolutionizing fashion, but perhaps most importantly in her vocals, which started off as tough, aggressive, and powerful from day one, and only got more so as her career and the music developed.
The roles for women had been set in the jazz age, and no one had yet broken out of that. Wendy completely demolished them.
Wendy was different because most of the women in music and in our culture at that time that were presented as role models or as women in the public sphere were all submissive, were decorative women. Most women didn't get angry. A lot of women smiled through a lot of bad shit. And Wendy combined a certain amount of physical aggression that was not there and a certain amount of autonomy that other women in the public sphere did not have at that time.
I mean, her attitude on stage was take no prisoners, in your face, totally in your face.
First of all, there was Patti Smith, who was the first one to make it. Second one, Debbie Harry. You know, there were not many of females. And she was the first hard rock who just really went all the way with it, or influences of metal and everything, and really performed. And it was, I think it was very, very different than anything else.
We choose to do heavy, uncompromising rock and roll.
In addition to wielding a sledgehammer, Wendy's use of a chainsaw to saw guitars in half established in no uncertain terms that this was a woman who was not to be taken as passive, submissive, or setting out to make people comfortable, and this made the establishment see red.
Even in feminism, a lot of feminism revolved around getting a middle-class job. It didn't revolve around being more assertive, physically assertive, and sexually in control as well, enjoying your sexuality. That there was not, in feminism, there was no room for sexuality because people were very afraid of the objectification that had happened before. And Wendy was able to combine both of those things. She was able to take the ideas of feminism and embrace her sexuality and enjoy it as a woman at the same time.
And also she had a unique voice. Now this is going to sound sexist, but it's not meant to sound sexist. Supposed hard rock, female-orientated band. As soon as they open their mouths, it sounds like girls singing, and doesn't have the power of the normal, usual growl. Wendy had the growl.
Doesn't matter whether Wendy is male or female in that respect, because it was what she did what was important, and she transcended that whole male-female thing. in a way that very few artists manage to do, certainly very few female artists. We've heard so often they're very good for a girl band, or she's a very good female guitarist. People stopped using that for a large extent with Wendy. She was very good, full stop. It doesn't matter whether she was male or female in that respect.
And Wendy could hold her own against any vocalist, I think, in the world, really. You know, she had an amazing voice.